There is a ship. It moves across water that has no name. The night around it is deep and still, broken only by the soft press of waves against wood. Somewhere on deck, a lantern swings. Its light catches the edge of a rail, the curve of a sail, and then fades back into darkness. No one speaks. The crew sleeps below, or pretends to. Above them, a helmsman keeps his hands steady on the wheel, though there is nowhere in particular to steer. There is only forward. There is only the rhythm of the water and the creak of timber settling into itself. If you stood on that deck, you would see nothing. No coastline, no distant glow of harbor lights. Only the horizon dissolving into the same black as the sky. The stars are there, scattered and cold, but they do not guide. They only watch. This ship is not lost. It simply has no destination that can be drawn on parchment. It moves toward a place that does not yet exist in ink, and the men aboard it know this. They feel it in the way the wind ever changes, in the way the ocean stretches out in all directions without offering a single clue. Once the world had edges, not metaphorical ones, real edges. Places where the maps ended, where the ink stopped, where the careful hand of the cartographer lifted the pen and left only blankness behind. These were not mistakes. They were admissions. Beyond this point, we do not know. Beyond this point, the world becomes uncertain, and uncertainty, in those days, was not a concept. It was a place. You could sail toward it. Watch it grow closer, day by day, as the known world fell away behind you like a shadow slipping off a deck. The men on this ship are sailing toward that uncertainty now. They do not speak of it often. There is no need. It is there in the silence between them, in the way they check the ropes a second time, in the way they look at the horizon, and then look away, as if seeing too much might confirm what they already fear, that the world does not go on forever, that somewhere ahead it stops. The lantern swings again. The light touches the water, just for a moment, and reveals nothing, only more water. Only the same endless shifting surface that has been there since morning, since yesterday, since the last time they saw land, and that was days ago, or weeks. Time loses its shape out here. It becomes something else, something slower. The sun rises and sets, but it does not mark progress. It only marks repetition. One day folds into the next, and the sea remains the same. The ship moves forward, but forward into what? That is the question no one asks aloud, because the answer is not comforting. The answer is, we do not know. The answer is, the map ends before we do. As so they sail into the night, into the unknown, into the space between what was drawn and what was feared. The wood creaks, the water whispers. And somewhere far behind them, the edge of the last map grows smaller and smaller until it is only a memory. There was a time when the world was small, not in truth perhaps, but in understanding, in the boundaries of what could be known, what could be walked, what could be drawn with confidence on a sheet of parchment stretched flat beneath a careful hand. Maps were not always tools of exploration. Sometimes they were admissions of limit. Cartographer would begin at the center, the place he knew, and work outward, line by line, until the ink reached a point where certainty dissolved. And there he would stop. Not because the world stopped, but because his knowledge did. The edges of those early maps were not dramatic. There were no great pronouncements, no warnings etched in ornate script. Just empty space, white parchment, the absence of lines where lines could no longer be trusted. And that absence meant something. It meant, beyond this, We cannot say. It meant, here, the world becomes a guess. For the people who lived within those borders, the known world was enough. It had to be. There were seas to tend, fields to plow, coastlines to fish. The idea of what lay beyond the edge was not a daily concern. It was a distant thought, something reserved for sailors and madmen, for those who had no choice but to push against the boundary. But the boundary was always there. You could feel it, even if you never approached it. It lived in the stories people told, in the unease that crept into a conversation when someone mentioned a ship that had sailed too far and never returned, in the way map, when unrolled on a table, seemed to end too soon, leaving the imagination to fill in what the ink could not. And imagination, when left unchecked, does not conjure paradise. The early maps had edges because people needed them. A world without limits is a world without shape, and a world without shape is too vast, too formless, too indifferent to hold. It becomes something the mind cannot anchor to. So the edges were drawn, not where the world ended, but where understanding did. And for a long time that was enough. But then slowly, something began to change. Ships grew larger, sails grew stronger, men grew bolder, or more desperate, or simply more curious. They began to push at the edges, not with armies or tools, but with movement, with the slow, steady insistence of a hull cutting through water. And the edges began to move, not all at once, not dramatically, but bit by bit. The blank spaces on the map started to shrink. A new coastline appeared here, an island there. The line that once marked the end of the known world shifted outward, just a little, and what had been unknown became, briefly, familiar. But the unknown did not vanish. It only moved farther away. Because every time a map expanded, the question remained, what lies beyond this? What waits in the space we have not yet drawn? The answer was always the same. We do not know. And that not knowing was not neutral. It was heavy. It carried weight. It pressed against the mind like the dark presses against a lantern's light. Always there, always waiting, always ready to swallow the glow if the flame faltered. People lived with this weight differently. Some ignored it. They kept their eyes on the fields, the streets, the known paths that looped through their lives without variation. The edge of the map was not their concern. It belonged to others. Some feared it. They imagined what might wait in those blank spaces and decided firmly that it was better not to know, better to stay within the lines, better to let the unknown remain exactly that. And some, only some, felt drawn to it, not because they were braver or wiser or more deserving, but because the absence called to them in a way they could not explain. The blank space on the map was not a warning. It was an invitation, and so they went. They left the harbors where the map still made sense. They sailed past the last marked island, the final annotated reef. They moved into the space where the parchment offered nothing but silence. And the world did not stop them. It simply opened wider. The edges of the map had always been a comfort, in their way. They told you where you stood. They gave you a frame. They said, this far and no farther. But the sea does not respect frames. It does not care what has been drawn, or what has been feared, or what has been imagined in the mind of a man staring at blank parchment by candlelight. It simply continues. And every map ends where certainty ends. There is something about emptiness that demands to be filled. A blank page, a silent room, a stretch of parchment where no line has been drawn. The eye moves across it, searching for something to hold on to, a mark, a word, a shape that gives the emptiness meaning. But sometimes There is nothing, just the blankness itself. On the early maps, these spaces were not accidents. They were not oversights or failures of craft. They were deliberate. The cartographer's hand moved across the known coastlines, tracing harbors and rivers and the edges of continents with care. And then, at a certain point, the hand stopped. Not because the world stopped, but because knowledge did. And so the parchment remained blank, white, unmarked, open. These were not spaces waiting to be filled with truth. They were spaces that held the absence of truth, and absence has its own presence. It sits there, quiet and patient, neither inviting nor warning. It simply is. If you looked at one of these maps, your eye would follow the coastline until it ended, and then it would drift into the blank, and in that drift, something would happen. Your mind would begin to fill the space on its own, not with facts, with shapes. The blank spaces on maps were never truly empty. They were filled with the imagination of everyone who looked at them. Filled with guesses, with fears, with the quiet suspicion that the world beyond the known was not like the world within it. Some cartographers tried to soften the blankness. They drew symbols in the margins. Waves must sometimes, clouds, wind, as if to say, this space is not unknown. It is simply ocean, simply sky, simply more of what you already understand. But the symbols did not erase the blank. They only framed it. And framing emptiness does not make it less empty. It only makes it more visible. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in these spaces. Not the silence of a room where no one speaks, but the silence of a question that has no answer. The silence of a sentence that ends mid-thought and never returns. Here be nothing, not monsters, not danger, not the edge of the world crumbling into void, just nothing. And nothing is harder to imagine than something, because something has shape, something can be prepared for, something can be feared or fought or understood, but nothing offers no foothold. It is the absence of event, the absence of change, the absence of anything that would allow the mind to orient itself. And so the blank spaces on the maps were not just geographic. They were psychological. They were the places where certainty ended and the mind had to do the rest. Some people looked at those blanks and saw a possibility. They imagined new lands, new routes, new coastlines, waiting to be named. The blank was a canvas. The blank was permission. Others looked at the same blank and saw warning. They imagined emptiness so vast it could swallow a ship without a sound. They imagined water that went on forever, unchanging, indifferent. The blank did not choose between these interpretations. It held them both, because a blank space is not a statement, it is an opening, and what you see in the opening depends on what you bring to it. The cartographers knew this. They did not fill the blanks because they could not, but they also did not fill them because perhaps the blanks were useful. A map with no edges is a map that promises too much. A map with blank spaces is a map that admits its limits, and limits, even false ones, give shape to the world. Here be silence, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, the silence of absence, the silence of the unmapped, the unnamed, the unseen, the silence of water stretching farther than any eye has followed, the silence of horizons that dissolve into themselves without offering a single landmark, the silence of wind that blows across emptiness and finds nothing to disturb. This silence is not hostile. It is not kind. It simply is. And the blank spaces on the maps were where that silence lived. not as a feature to be feared or conquered, but as a truth to be acknowledged. We do not know what is there. We have not been. We cannot say. And so we leave it blank. The blankness was honest. In its way, it did not lie. It did not invent. It simply refused to pretend that guessing was the same as knowing. But honesty does not make emptiness easier to bear. And so the people who looked at those maps, sailors preparing for a voyage, merchants planning a route, rulers imagining the extent of their world, felt the weight of the blank. It was always there, at the edge of the parchment, waiting, not with malice, not with promise, just waiting. Because the blank does not care if you approach it. It does not care if you turn away. It remains, and every map ends where certainty ends. But the world does not. Fear does not always arrive with fangs and fire. Sometimes it arrives as a question that has no answer. What is out there? For the people who lived when maps still had edges, this question was not abstract. It was immediate. It lived in the harbor, in the moment before a ship's ropes were untied. It lived in the taverns where sailors spoke in low voices about routes that disappeared into blank parchment. It lived in the mind of every person who looked west or south or toward any horizon that had not yet been drawn. And the mind, when given nothing concrete to hold, begins to build its own answers. Not from evidence, from instinct. Some believed the oceans simply went on forever, not as a wonder, as a trap. They imagined water without end, stretching in all directions, unchanging and indifferent. A sailor could point his ship toward the horizon and sail for days, weeks, months, and find nothing, no land, no shift in the wind, no birds overhead to signal the nearness of shore, just water, and more water. And the slow realization that there was no destination, that the ship had left the world behind and entered a place where the world no longer applied. This was not a fear of monsters. It was a fear of sameness, of monotony so complete it erased meaning, of waking each day to the same horizon, the same sky, the same endless repetition of waves rising and falling without variation. It was the fear that the unknown was not strange. It was empty. Others believed the world had an edge, not a symbolic one, a real one. A place where the ocean ended and the ship, if it sailed far enough, would simply fall into what? No one could say. The void, the underneath, the space beyond space. It did not matter. The falling was enough. This belief was not based on observation. No one had ever sailed to the edge and returned to describe it. But the belief persisted because it made sense in a way that felt true. If the world is a thing, it must have limits. If it has limits, it must have borders. And if it has borders, those borders must be somewhere. The edge of the world was not a myth to these people. It was a logical conclusion. A boundary that had to exist, even if no one had ever seen it. And so they imagined it, a line in the ocean where the water stopped, where the wave no longer rose and fell but simply ended, pouring off into nothingness like water spilling from the lip of a cup. They imagined the sound it would make, the roar, the rush. They imagined the moment a ship would reach it, too late to turn back, too close to stop, and tip forward into the fall. It was not a pleasant image, but it was an image. And an image, even a terrible one, is better than blankness. Some believed the sea itself would change, that beyond a certain point, the water would become something else, something unnatural. Boiling, perhaps, or freezing into a sheet of ice so thick no hull could break it, or turning to mist so dense it would choke the sails and leave the ship drifting, blind, unable to move forward or back. These were not wild fantasies. They were attempts to explain what might happen when the known gave way to the unknown. If the world we understand has rules, perhaps the world beyond has different rules, or no rules at all. The fog was a common image, thick, impenetrable, swallowing ships whole. It made sense, in a way. Fog obscures, it hides, it takes away sight and sound and certainty. A ship sailing into fog loses its bearings. It cannot see the stars, cannot see the horizon, cannot see its own bow. It becomes untethered, and untethered, it could drift anywhere or nowhere. The idea of fog waiting at the edge of the map was comforting almost. It explained why no one returned, not because they fell, not because they were destroyed, but because they were lost. Still sailing, perhaps, still moving through the mist, still searching for something solid. But the fog does not end, and so neither do they. There were quieter fears, too. Not of falling or boiling or fog, but of simply stopping. The idea that the world at a certain point would refuse to continue, that the wind would die, that the water would become still, that the ship would sit, motionless, in a place where nothing moved and nothing changed, not dramatic, not violent, just stopped. This fear had no image attached to it, no edge to picture, no sound to imagine. It was the fear of absence itself, of reaching a place where the world simply was not, where there was no land, no sky, no horizon. Just the ship floating in a space that had no name. These beliefs were not universal. Not everyone feared the edge. Not everyone believed it existed, but enough did. Enough that the blank spaces on the maps carried weight. Enough that a sailor standing on deck at night, staring at the line where the ocean met the sky, might wonder if that line was the last one. If beyond it there was nothing left to see. The world did not promise safety beyond the known. It did not promise land, or wind, or anything at all. It only promised distance. And distance, when stretched far enough, begins to feel like disappearance. There is a moment, in every voyage, when the last familiar thing disappears. A coastline, a landmark, a reef marked on the map. It slips below the horizon, and suddenly there is nothing left to measure against, no reference, no return point visible in the distance. Just the ship, and the water, and the sky, and the slow understanding that everything from here forward is unmapped. The first sailors to push past the known world did not set out as heroes. They were not driven by glory or the promise of their names carved into history. Most of them were driven by need, by trade routes that had grown too crowded, too dangerous, by rulers who wanted wealth and were willing to send others to find it, by hunger or debt or the simple, desperate hope that somewhere beyond the edge of the map there was something better. They left harbors where the maps still made sense, where the ink was clear and the coastlines matched the stories, and they sailed toward the blank, not quickly, not with confidence, but steadily. One day folding into the next, the wind pushing them farther from anything they could name. The crew would have felt it first, the unease, not panic, not yet, just a low, persistent discomfort that settled into the routine of the ship. It showed in the way the men checked the ropes more often than necessary, in the way they looked at the horizon and then looked away, as if the sight of all that emptiness was too much to hold for long. It showed in the silence. Sailors are not quiet people. But out there, past the last known island, past the final marked reef, the talk began to thin. Because what was there to say? The ocean looks the same today as it did yesterday. The wind has not changed. The horizon has not moved. We are still here, But where is here? The maps, if they had been brought aboard, would have been useless now. The ship had sailed past the point where the ink stopped. It was moving through space that existed only in rumor and guess, and rumor is a poor guide. At night, the stars would still be there. The same stars they had always used to navigate, but stars only tell you direction. They do not tell you what waits in that direction. They do not tell you if the world continues or if it stops. The helmsman would keep his hands on the wheel, steering by instinct more than knowledge. There was no course to follow, no destination marked in degrees and distances, just forward, always forward. Because turning back was not an option. Not because it was forbidden, but because turning back meant admitting that the voyage had been for nothing, that they had come this far only to retreat into the same limits they had left behind. And so they kept going, days without change, nights without answer, water pressing against the hull in the same rhythm it had pressed since the journey began. Repetition, endless repetition. The horizon never arrived. It only stayed ahead, always the same distance away, always promising nothing. Some of the crew would have wondered, quietly, if they had already passed the edge. The world had ended behind them, and they simply had not noticed. If they were sailing now through some in-between place, neither map nor reel, a stretch of ocean that existed only because they were moving through it, it was not a comforting thought. But it was a thought that made sense in its way, because if the world had an edge, and they had not yet found it, then either the edge was farther than anyone imagined, or it did not exist at all. And if it did not exist, then what were they sailing toward? The question had no answer, and so it hung in the air, unspoken, alongside the creak of the mast and the whisper of the sails. They were not chasing discovery. They were running out of shore, and the ocean, indifferent, simply let them continue. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden sight of land rising from the waves, no confirmation that the voyage had been worth the risk, just more water, more distance, more of the same horizon endlessly deferred. And somewhere in that sameness, the fear began to shift. Not disappear, but change, because the edge had not arrived, the world had not ended, the ship had not fallen, or boiled, or been swallowed by fog. It had simply sailed, and the ocean had let it. And that, in its own way, was more unsettling than any edge could have been, because it meant the unknown was not a wall. It was not a boundary to be crossed or feared. It was only distance. And distance does not care how far you go. It simply continues, farther and farther and farther still. There is a kind of time that exists only at sea, not the time measured by bells or sun's position overhead, not the time that divides the day into hours, the hours into moments, a different time, slower, thicker, time that stretches until it loses its edges, until one day becomes indistinguishable from the next, until the memory of yesterday blurs into the reality of now. The ship moves through this time without marking it. The sails fill, the hull cuts through water, the mast creaks in the wind, but nothing changes. The horizon is the same. The color of the water is the same. The rhythm of the waves rising and falling against the ship is the same, day after day, the same. At first, the crew tries to hold on to difference. They note the angle of the sun. They watch for birds. They study the water for signs of current or shift, but the signs do not come. The ocean offers nothing, no variation, no landmark, no promise that anything ahead will be different from what is here now. Just water, everywhere, in all directions, the same water. Morning arrives, but it does not feel like arrival. It feels like continuation. The sun rises over the same horizon it set behind. The light touches the same waves. The day begins the way the last one ended, with sameness. There's a strange comfort in this at first. The predictability, the lack of danger, no storms, no reefs, no sudden shift in wind that might tear a sail or snap a mast. Just the steady, unchanging press of water against wood. The ship sails on, and on, and on. But comfort, when stretched too long, becomes something else. It becomes weight. The crew begins to move more slowly, not from exhaustion, but from the sense that there is no urgency, no reason to hurry, no destination approaching that would require preparation. They perform their tasks, adjusting ropes, checking the sails, swabbing the deck, but the tasks feel hollow, repetitions without purpose, because nothing they do changes where they are. And where they are is nowhere, not lost, just suspended in a space that has no features, no name, no place on any map. The helmsman keeps his hands on the wheel, steering toward a horizon that never grows closer. His eyes are open, but after days of seeing the same thing, they begin to glaze. Not from sleep, but from the brain's quiet surrender to monotony. There is nothing to see, so the eyes stop searching. Below deck, the men sleep more than they need to. Not because they are tired, but because sleep is the only thing that breaks the sameness. In sleep, the ocean disappears. The horizon stops pressing against the mind. But when they wake, it is still there, the same water, the same sky, the same ship, drifting forward through a world that offers no sign. It is listening. At night, the stars appear, the same stars. They wheel slowly overhead, marking the passage of hours in a way the ocean does not. But even the stars begin to feel like repetition. The same constellations, the same positions, the same silent confirmation that time is passing. Even if nothing else is, the men stop talking about where they are going, not because they have given up hope, but because the question has lost its meaning. Where they are going is the same as where they are now, and where they are now is the same as where they were yesterday. And yesterday is the same as the day before. The ocean does not offer transformation. It offers endurance, and endurance, when there is no end in sight, becomes a kind of erasure. The mind begins to drift, not in panic, not in fear, just drift. Thoughts lose their sharpness, memories blur. The difference between waking and sleeping becomes harder to name. The ship moves. But does it, or is it the water that moves, sliding past the hull in an endless loop, giving the illusion of progress, while the ship itself remains fixed in place? There is no way to know, no way to measure, no landmark to confirm that the ship has traveled any distance at all. The ocean offers no proof. It simply continues, wave after wave, horizon after horizon. The same unchanging vastness, stretching farther than sight, farther than thought, farther than the mind can hold without beginning to collapse inward. This is the deep water, not deep in the sense of depth beneath the hull, deep in the sense of time, deep in the sense of distance that has no reference, deep in the sense of a question asked over and over until the question itself becomes meaningless. Where are we? Here. Where is here? Nowhere. Nowhere that can be named. Nowhere that can be mapped. Nowhere that has ever been or will ever be again, except in this moment, on this ship, moving through this water that has no memory and no destination. The sails hang in the wind. The ropes creak softly, the hull presses forward, steady and slow, and the ocean, indifferent, allows it. There is no drama here, no storm rising from the deep, no sudden danger, no moment of crisis that would break the monotony and give the crew something to fight against. Just the sameness, and the sameness is enough. It presses against the mind until the mind stops resisting, until it accepts that this is what the unknown is, not a place of wonder or terror, just a place of more water, more sky, more distance, more of the same, and the ship, small and quiet, drifts through it all, forward, always forward, into the endlessness that does not care if it is crossed. There comes a moment when waiting stops making sense, not because the thing you are waiting for has arrived, but because the waiting itself has lasted so long that the mind begins to let it go. The crew had been waiting for the edge, not consciously perhaps, not as a single thought held at the front of the mind, but it was there, beneath everything, a quiet expectation that at some point something would happen. The ocean would change, the horizon would break, the world would offer some signal that they had reached the boundary. But the signal never came. The ocean remained the same. The horizon stayed fixed in the distance. The world simply continued, offering no proof that it had limits, no confirmation that the unknown had an ending. And slowly, without ceremony, the waiting dissolved, not into relief, into something quieter. The realization that there was no edge, or if there was, it was so far away that it made no difference. The fear had been specific: falling, boiling, fog, the world stopping. But none of these things happened. The ship did not tip over the rim of the world. The water did not turn to steam or ice. The air did not thicken into mist. The wind did not die. Everything simply continued, and that continuation was not comforting. It was unsettling, in a way the crew could not name, because fear, at least, has shape. You can prepare for an edge. You can imagine it, brace for it, decide whether to approach it or turn away. But how do you prepare for absence? How do you brace for the fact that the thing you feared does not exist? The edge had given the unknown a boundary. It had made the unknown finite, crossable, something that could be reached and perhaps survived. But without the edge, the unknown became something else. It became endless, not in theory, in practice. The ship had been sailing for weeks, maybe longer. Time had lost its clarity, but the distance covered was real. The wind had carried them farther than any map had ever suggested was possible. Yet still, there was nothing. No land, no change. No indication that they were any closer to anything than they had been when they started. The ocean had swallowed the edge, or the edge had never existed at all. And the mind, confronted with this, does not celebrate. It recoils, because endless is harder to hold than a finite. Finite has limits. You can walk to the edge of something finite and stand there, knowing you have reached the end. But endless offers no such moment. You can move through it forever and never arrive. There is no end to reach, no moment of completion, just more, always more. The helmsman had stopped waiting for the horizon to reveal something. He steered now out of habit, not hope. His hands on the wheel were steady, but his eyes had stopped searching. There was nothing to see that he had not already seen. The crew moved through their routines without speaking of the edge, not because it was forbidden, but because there was nothing left to say about it. It had not come, and the longer it did not come, the more it seemed like it never would. The fear began to shift, not disappear. Fear does not vanish just because the thing you feared fails to arrive. It changes. The fear was no longer of the edge. It was of the endlessness, of the possibility that the ocean would continue like this forever, that there was no destination, no land, no point at which the ship would find something other than water, that they were adrift in a world that had no center and no boundary, just distance, stretching in all directions, indifferent to whether they crossed it or not. This was not the fear they had prepared for, and so they had no defense against it. The ocean offered no cruelty. It did not punish them for sailing too far. It did not rise up in anger or swallow the ship in a storm. It simply allowed them to continue, day after day, week after week, the same water, the same sky, the same unchanging horizon. And the realization, slow and quiet, that the unknown was not a place, it was a condition of being too far from the known to return, but not far enough into the unknown to find anything new, a place in between, where the map had ended, but the world had not. Where their ship moved forward, but forward meant nothing, where distance was no longer a measurement, it was just a fact. The edge never came, only distance did. And distance, when stretched beyond meaning, becomes something the mind cannot hold. It slips through thought, like water through a net. You reach for it, and it is not there. You try to measure it, and the numbers lose their sense. You try to imagine the end of it, and the imagination falters, because the end is not coming. Only more distance, more water, more of the same endlessness. It does not care if you name it or understand it. It simply is, and the ship, small and quiet, moves through it, not toward anything, not away from anything, just through. The maps did not stay blank forever. Slowly, over years, over decades, the empty spaces began to fill. A coastline appeared here, an island there, a new trade route marked in careful ink. The blank parchment shrank, the known world expanded, but the edge did not disappear. It only moved, farther out, farther away, always just beyond the last thing that had been drawn, because a map is not a picture of the world. It is a picture of what has been understood, and understanding has limits. No matter how far a ship sails, no matter how many coastlines are charted, there is always a point where the ink stops, where the cartographer lifts the pen and leaves the rest to blankness. Not because the world ends there, but because knowledge does, and so the edge is never fixed. It is always moving, following the expansion of what is known, staying just ahead of it, like a shadow that can never be caught. The sailors who pushed past the first blank spaces did not erase the unknown. They only shifted it. They proved that the ocean continued past the point where the maps had ended. They found land where the parchment had suggested only emptiness. They returned with stories of coastlines and currents and winds that had never been recorded, and the cartographers listened. They added the new information to the maps. They extended the lines. They filled in the blank spaces with detail. And then they stopped, and the new blank began. Because there was always more ocean, always more distance, always another horizon that had not yet been crossed. The edge was not a lie. It was a necessity. People need boundaries. They need to know where the known ends and the unknown begins. Without that division, the world becomes too vast, too formless, too much to hold in the mind all at once. And so the edge is drawn, not where the world stops, but where certainty does. And certainty is always smaller than the world. The ships kept sailing, decade after decade, century after century. They pushed farther and farther, filling the maps with names and numbers and lines that connected one place to another, but the maps never became complete. Because completion would require knowing everything, and knowing everything is not possible. There is always something farther, some current not yet charted, some depth not yet measured, some stretch of water that no hull has crossed, and so the blank remains. It just moves. In the early days, the blank was close. You could sail for a few weeks and reach it. The edge of the map was within reach of anyone willing to risk the voyage. But as the maps grew, the blank moved farther away. It took longer to reach. It required more preparation, more supplies, more willingness to leave the known behind for an extended time. And eventually the blank moved so far that most people stopped thinking about it. It became theoretical, distant, a problem for explorers and cartographers, not for the people who lived within the borders of the known. But it was still there, always there. At the edge of every map, no matter how detailed, there was a point where the lines stopped, where the ink gave way to white, where the world, once again, became uncertain. And that uncertainty was not a flaw. It was an honesty. The maps that admitted their limits were more truthful than the maps that pretended to show everything, because everything cannot be shown. The world is too large, too complex, too constantly shifting. By the time a map is finished, the world has already changed. Coastlines erode, rivers shift, islands emerge from the sea or sink beneath it. The world does not hold still long enough to be fully captured, and so the maps, no matter how careful, are always incomplete. And the edge is always moving, farther and farther and farther still. But the movement of the edge reveals something important. It reveals that the unknown is not a place. It is a relationship between what we have seen and what we have not, between what we can name and what remains nameless, between the lines on the map and the blankness that surrounds them. And that relationship does not end. It only shifts. As we learn more, the unknown grows smaller, but it never vanishes, because the unknown is not a fixed amount of space waiting to be filled. It is the condition of being at the edge of what we understand, and no matter how far understanding reaches, there is always an edge, always a point where knowledge stops and guessing begins. The edge is not the end of the world. It is the end of certainty, and certainty, by its nature, is always limited. The maps will keep expanding. The blank spaces will keep shrinking. But the edge will never disappear. It will only move, and we will follow it, not because we must, but because the edge is where the questions are. And questions, even unanswered ones, pull at the mind in ways that certainty cannot. The edge moves, and we move with it, always one step behind, always reaching for the line that stays just out of reach, always mapping the world, and always leaving something unmapped. The maps are different now. They do not have blank spaces, not in the way they once did. Every coastline has been traced, every ocean crossed, every continent named and divided into smaller and smaller pieces until the world on paper appears complete. But completion is a kind of illusion because the edges are still there. They have just moved inward into places the maps cannot show. The unknown has not disappeared. It has only changed shape. It no longer lives at the edges of the parchment. It lives in the spaces between what can be measured and what can be felt, in the depths of the ocean, where no light reaches, in the processes of the mind, where thought becomes something else, in the questions that have no answers, even when all the facts are known. We still search for edges, not because we need them to navigate, but because we need them to feel safe. An edge is a limit, and a limit is a kind of comfort. It tells you where you are. It tells you how far you can go. It tells you that the world, no matter how vast, has boundaries. And boundaries make the world manageable. Without them, the world becomes too much, too large, too complex, too indifferent to the fact that we are trying to understand it. And so we draw edges, not on maps anymore, but in our minds. We divide the world into categories, known and unknown, safe and dangerous, ours and theirs. We create borders where none exist naturally, because borders give us a place to stand. They tell us, this side is familiar, that side is not. This side is understood, that side requires caution. And a caution is not always about danger. Sometimes it is just about the discomfort of not knowing. The unknown has always been uncomfortable, not because it is hostile, but because it is formless. It does not offer footholds. It does not respond to preparation. It does not care if you approach it with courage or fear. It simply is. And the mind, when confronted with something that simply is, without explanation or pattern, reacts by trying to give it shape, by trying to turn it into something that can be named, something that can be understood, something that has an edge, because an edge means the unknown is finite. It means you can walk to the boundary, look across, and decide whether to cross or turn back. But the unknown does not have edges, not real ones. It only has the edges we imagine for it, the edges we draw in our minds to make it feel smaller, more contained, more survivable. And those edges move, just like the edges on the old maps. As we learn more, as we push farther, the edges shift. What was unknown yesterday becomes known today. And the unknown moves farther out, into the next thing we have not yet named. This is not progress exactly. It is movement, and movement is not the same as arrival. Because arrival would mean reaching a point where there is nothing left to know, where the world has been fully mapped, fully understood, fully tamed. But that point does not exist. The world is too large, and even if it were not, the world is always changing. New questions arise, new mysteries appear, new edges form where none existed before, and so the search continues. Not because we are brave, but because we cannot help it. The unknown pulls at us, not with force, not with demand, just with presence. It sits at the edge of what we know, quiet and patient, and we feel it there. We feel the weight of the unanswered question, the pull of the unnamed place, the curiosity, or the fear, or the simple restlessness that comes from knowing there is something beyond the boundary we have drawn. And so we cross it. Not always, not everyone, but some of us. Enough of us. We step past the line, into the space where the map ends, and we find almost always that the unknown was not what we imagined. It was not as dangerous as we feared, or as welcoming as we hoped. It was just more world, more complexity, more detail, more of the same vastness that has always been there, waiting to be seen, and seeing it does not make it smaller. It only makes it more familiar. Familiarity is not the same as understanding. You can walk the same path every day and never fully understand why it curves where it does, or why the trees grow in that particular pattern, or what the ground beneath your feet is made of at its deepest layers. Familiarity just means you have stopped being surprised, and the world, once it stops surprising you, begins to feel smaller, not because it has shrunk, but because your attention has. You stop looking for edges because you assume they are not there. You stop asking questions because you assume the answers are known. And the unknown, which has always been present, fades into the background, but it does not disappear. It is still there, at the edge of every certainty, at the limit of every explanation, at the place where the words run out and the silence begins. We search for edges because the edges give us shape. They tell us where we end and the rest of the world begins. They give us a place to stand, a direction to face, a sense that we are not adrift in formlessness. But the edges are not real. They are drawn by us, for us, to make the world feel less overwhelming. And there is no shame in that. The world is overwhelming. It is larger than any single mind can hold, more complex than any single life can witness. And so we simplify. We draw lines. We create categories. We build maps that show us where we are and where we are not. And we tell ourselves that the map is the world. But it is not. The map is just a tool. A way of holding a piece of the world in our hands without being crushed by the weight of the whole. And the edges on the map are just the places where we stopped looking. Not because there was nothing more to see, but because we had seen enough. For now, the unknown is not behind us. It is not something we have conquered, or outgrown, or left behind in the past. It is still here, still present, still waiting at the edge of every map, every thought, every certainty. It is just quieter now, less visible, less immediate, but no less real. And we will keep searching for it, not because we must, but because the edge, even when it is imagined, even when it is drawn by our own hand, pulls at us. It asks, what is beyond this? And the question, once asked, does not fade. It lingers, it waits, and eventually, someone crosses the line, and the edge moves again. The ship is still moving, not toward anything, not away from anything, just moving. The sails catch the wind, slow and steady. The hull presses through the water, cutting a line that closes behind it, leaving no trace. The night has returned, or perhaps it never left. It is hard to say. Hard to remember when the light faded, or if it faded at all, or if the darkness has always been there, just waiting for the eyes to adjust. The lantern swings on deck. Its light is dim now. A soft glow that barely reaches the edges of the rail, but it is enough to see the wood beneath your feet, enough to know you are still here, still aboard, still drifting through the same water that has been here since the beginning. The horizon is gone, not hidden, just irrelevant. There is no need to watch for it anymore. No need to measure the distance between here and there, because there is no there. Only here, and here is everywhere. The water stretches out in all directions, dissolving into the dark. The sky does the same. The line where they meet, the line that once seemed so important, has faded. It does not matter where the water ends and the sky begins. They are both the same, both endless, both indifferent, both simply there. The ship drifts, not because the wind is pushing it, but because there is no reason to stop, no harbor to aim for, no shore to reach, no destination marked on any map that would tell you when the journey is over. The journey's not over, but it is not continuing either. It is simply happening. One moment folding into the next without distinction, without progress, without any sense that time is moving in a particular direction. The crew is quiet. Perhaps they are asleep. Perhaps they are awake, staring at the same dark water, the same empty sky, the same absence of anything to hold on to. It does not matter. Sleep and waking have become the same out here. Both are just ways of being present in a place that does not care if you are present or not. The helmsman's hands rest on the wheel. He is not steering exactly. There is no course to follow. But his hands stay there, out of habit, out of the comfort of holding something solid. The wheel turns slightly, guided by the current, by the wind, by forces too subtle to name, and the ship follows. Not toward the edge. There is no edge. There never was. The edge was always just a line drawn in the mind, a boundary imagined to make the vastness feel smaller, more manageable, more survivable. But the vastness does not need to be managed. It does not need to be survived. It simply needs to be, and the ship, small and quiet, drifts through it. The water whispers against the hull. A soft sound, rhythmic, almost like breathing. In, out, in, out. The ocean breathing, the ship breathing, the night breathing, all of it moving together, slowly, gently, without effort. There is no struggle here, no fight against the current, no battle with the wind, just drift. The lantern light flickers, not from wind, just from age. The flame inside is small now, almost gone. But it does not matter if it goes out. The dark is not hostile. It is just the absence of light, and its absence is not something to fear. It is just space. Space where something else might be, or might not be. Space that holds nothing and everything at once. The stars are there, somewhere overhead, hidden perhaps, or just too faint to see. But they are there, have always been there, moving in their slow, eternal patterns, indifferent to whether anyone watches them or not. The ship drifts beneath them, through water that has no name, across distances that cannot be measured, into a night that has no end, and it is enough. The drifting is enough. The movement without destination is enough. The presence without purpose is enough, because the edge was never the point. The edge was just a story we told ourselves to make the journey feel like it had a shape, but the journey has no shape. It is just movement, and movement does not need a reason. It does not need a goal. It simply is. The ship drifts. The water moves. The night holds everything in its quiet embrace. And somewhere far away, or perhaps right here, it is impossible to say, the world continues, not mapped, not understood, not conquered or claimed or named, just continuing, the way it always has, the way it always will, and the ship, small and quiet, drifts through it all, forward or backward or never, just drifting into the vastness, into the unknown, into the space where edges exist only in the mind, and dissolve, slowly, gently, like mist dissolving into morning. The lantern flickers one last time, and then, softly, quietly, the light fades